Good morning to all of those of you who have just joined us, and thank you very much for joining us for the first of our Vantage Point interview series. We're thrilled to have Mark Ganz, former CEO of Cambia Health Solutions, and a leader in healthcare in his own right across a number of dimensions, and with some experiences that I think you're all going to find enormously interesting and very thought-provoking. Just by way of the business at hand, the Vantage Point series is a new series that MHCC has started. Mark is our inaugural interviewee. We have other series coming up. We have Mickey Tripathi, whom we all know well and is now the National Coordinator for Information Technology. We have John Glasser. We have John Glasser, who is another former member of our consortium, former CIO for the Mass General Hospital, as well as an information technology executive with Cerner. And we have Alexandra Drain, who is well known and quite a figure in her own right when it comes to advocacy for patients and caregivers. And we're excited to have these folks joining us. And the reason we want to do the Vantage Point series is we want to talk to people not about data and technology. We talk about that all the time. We want to talk to folks about leadership, about purpose, about the kinds of things that allow us in our day-to-day work to step back from what we do and enjoy the benefit of the perspectives of those who have especially unique, thought-provoking, and certainly from their experience, very informed perspectives about the industry. Secondly, and Lynn, if you'll go to the next page, we are available for tweeting. You'll see as we bring up the next page that we have Twitter handles, hashtag MassHealthData, hashtag MHCCVP Ganz. If you're interested in tweeting, you see at Cambia. We welcome you to do that. As far as other rules of order, please put your questions in chat. We have an individual who will be monitoring the chat and compiling your questions so that we can devote the last part of our conversation with Mark today to answering your questions. We have about 75 minutes of discussion planned, which will leave us, when I wrap up, almost within the 5 minutes that I've allotted myself, we'll have some time to answer your questions and to get into other subjects that you're interested in learning more from Mark about. So we can close the landing page, and Mark, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. Mark, just in the moments that we have, just introduce yourself and tell us about who you are, where you come from, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about Cambia. Maybe we can spend 15 to 20 minutes talking about that, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. Well, good morning, or I should say afternoon, since most of you, I think, are past noon. It's still morning here in Portland, Oregon. And so I am a Northwest boy. I grew up in Spokane, Washington, the son of a family physician and a mother who took really good care of 6 kids, who she bore over the span of 9 years. So she had her hands full, and raised there. And we had a place up in northern Idaho on a lake in the summer times that I often refer to as kind of where my soul resides. It's such a beautiful place that is more about the natural world and the animal kingdom than it is about the human kingdom. And it's where I like to return to kind of fill my soul up after any period of time. Looking forward to going up there next month to once the snow has melted to open up our place there, because we now own a place there, and that's where our kids are learning that same wonderful mystery. I went to school at Georgetown University. That's where I met my wife, Leslie, who grew up in Connecticut, up in the northeastern corner in a little town called Pomfret, and where her mother and sister still live. And so we make sure that we get back east as often as we can. It's been really hard this last year, as it has been probably for all of you. But it does feel good to have achieved our vaccinations and beginning to be able to reconnect with family after a long time. I worked first as a lawyer in a law firm in Seattle for about 6 years, and then went in-house as general counsel of a Blue Shield plan in Tacoma called Pierce County Medical Blue Shield. There's a fun story about that company, which Denny, if you're interested, I'll tell briefly, but not at this point. I'll just finish. That company then joined with several other nonprofit Blue Cross and Blue Shield plans in the Northwest to form what was called the Regents Group, and that was formed in 1995. And unbeknownst to me, and the way your future opportunities work. In 2001, I hung up my legal cleats and became the CEO of our largest subsidiary, which was Regents Blue Cross Blue Shield of Oregon. And 2 years later, again, quite a surprise, ended up as CEO of the overall company, which we then renamed a few years later to Cambia Health Solutions. I have two children. They are a 25-year-old who's a professional golfer trying to make it to the PGA Tour, living down in Phoenix, and a daughter who is a sophomore at Georgetown University, and trying to find her way, toward, with virtual classes, like I'm sure so many of your children have been facing. But she's doing okay, and looking forward to in-person campus experience coming back for her junior year next year. So that's kind of a nutshell of both career path and family. And we have a German Shepherd dog named Luna, and she keeps me very busy and well exercised. So I enjoy that a lot. She's a COVID dog, and but also a retirement dog. I finished my time with Cambia after 18 years as its CEO, and passed the baton to the person I was certainly hoping the board would choose, but it was their choice. But he was ready, and his name is Jared Short, and he's going to be a fantastic CEO of the company, and already is making his mark in the first 3-4 months of his tenure. So, and I'm enjoying this first time in my life sabbatical.
I haven't had that experience yet. I'm looking forward to it as well. Mark, we have, for the time in front of us, we've got, I've broken it up into 3 sections. One is to talk more about Cambia and the history of the organization and the kinds of changes that you and the organization went through to become the Cambia that you eventually stepped down from as the CEO. Maybe 15 to 20 minutes on that. But after that, I want to really get into your background and talk about sort of where you came from. We've had these conversations in planning for this discussion and this interview. So while those of you who are in the audience may not be aware of this, we actually have a pretty organized interview guide, relatively speaking, because ideally these interviews go where they go. And then we would like to talk for maybe 30 minutes about, your leadership philosophy, the purpose for your, I think knowing what Cambia is, who you are and where you came from, and how the combination of both your personal and your professional experience inform your philosophy, your purpose, is a good conversation to have. So if that sounds good for you, sure. Let's start first with, talk about Cambia Health Solutions in your career there. Would you talk a little bit about, where Cambia came from and the effect, its impact on U.S. healthcare?
Sure. Well, I majored in history in college. So I think a company's roots, a company's history is an important, maybe the most important defining characteristic of an organization. And it's really about people. and the generations of people who have built a company and built a culture, which can, in some cases, be a really bad culture in some companies, and but it's one of those things that is not. You can't judge an organization just at a point in time. It's important to understand where it came from and what its values were from the very beginning, and then just see how the various generations of people who made up that company have altered it. In the case of our company, we have the distinction, I guess, that we were the first modern day health insurance company in the world, as far as we know. The company was formed in 1917, a year before the last major pandemic. And maybe not great timing from a business perspective, but a fantastic timing in terms of serving the community of people that it was built to serve. What I love about our history was that those who formed it were workers in the timber mills in the Northwest, particularly in Tacoma. And there was some workers in a mill there. And at that time, Tacoma was kind of the world capital for timber. And the Tacoma port is where a lot of the timber was shipped all over the world at that time. And there were many large mills. Well, one of those mills, the workers who were working in a dangerous industry, there was no OSHA standards, there was no workers' compensation, and there certainly was no health insurance. And if a worker got injured, as they often did in the mill, then they were left to their own devices or for their neighbors to try to help them in whatever way they could support them and their families. And one of those workers, or a group of them, came up with a kind of a novel idea at the time, which was, can we do a better way? Can we do a better job of helping our friends and our coworkers who get injured by maybe pooling a little bit of our weekly wages into a common fund, so that it's not just about bringing food over to the house, but it's actually about giving them access to maybe professional caregiving, doctors. And so they didn't have the sophistication to kind of manage it themselves. So they went to the managers of the mill and said, we have this idea, we'd like to do it. Will you agree to be the bank? Will you collect this portion of our weekly wages and manage the fund? And the managers were so taken by the idea, they said yes. And that was the beginning of Pierce County Medical Industrial Bureau. And what I love about that is they didn't have a name for it. They didn't call it health insurance because they didn't know what they were creating. They created something entirely new. So they called it an industrial bureau and managed it within the company. And then they reached out to local physicians and said, look, we don't have a lot of money, but we have some, and better to be paid in cash than in barter. And, if you can take what we can give you. And that was the foundation of the discounted medical network. And then that model was copied all over the Northwest, first in Tacoma at the other mills, and then across the entire Northwest. And eventually, some teachers in Texas decided, gee, this is a pretty good model. And so they adopted it down in Texas, and they were the first one to put a brand on it, and they called it Blue Cross. And so then the mills and physicians up in the Northwest, not to be outdone, figured, well, maybe we should have a brand too, and kind of a loose brand. And so they came up with Blue Shield. And that was the beginning. But what I love about that story is the values that founded it, which was, it wasn't about contributing the money so that it's there for me or my family. It was contributing the weekly wages to help someone else. It was always about and understood that the idea of insurance was a community value, and that maybe someday that value may come our direction, to me or my family. But that wasn't the reason for doing it. It was to help others. That's a value that's been somewhat lost or overcome in this country, but I don't think that but I still think it is the fundamental underpinning of what we today call health insurance. And if we could, it's my dream, my belief that if we could return that societal ethic back to that understanding of that's what it's about, then I think we do a better job of transforming our current broken system much more quickly. Because unfortunately, the view is now it's a much more of an entitlement mentality. It's like, I pay in, what can I get for it? And if I pay in $100 and I extract more than $100 of services or drugs or whatever, then I'm winning. But if I don't, well, then I'm losing. And that faceless health insurance company is winning. And that's not really what it was about. And so that's a value that I really that I always sort of understood, I guess, or had an early insight to, maybe just from the understanding of the history of companies like this. And that's what I tried to bring as a fundamental, foundational value to our company. It's one of the reasons why I'm a very strong believer in the notion of us being not-for-profit. Paying our taxes, not using the not-for-profit status to dodge taxes as so many healthcare organizations do, which I think is, if I could be czar for a day, I would eliminate. But maintaining that notion of being not-for-profit because it's a fundamental value about how healthcare should be organized in this country. That those who help facilitate access to care could exist and exist well and in a fulsome way, pay their employees well, and all of that, but do it with a fundamental value that it's not about how much money we can make. It's about how many people we can serve and how well can we serve them.
When you joined Cambia, it was not the organization that it is today. You had to go through a considerable amount of transformation and working from the inside out to bring about a number of the kinds of services, the kinds of focus, the kinds of culture that you're talking about now. Could you take us a little bit through sort of the organization when you essentially arrived, and the organization that you just recently left?
Yeah. Well, it was certainly the best decision I ever made in my career to join, at that time, Pierce County Medical. It was still called Pierce County Medical when I joined it in Tacoma. At that point, it had about 250,000 members but was restricted by geography to basically Pierce County and just a little bit of the county north and south, by the license that it held, the Blue Shield license that it held. But in that area, it was certainly the strongest health insurer. And I was blessed to join an amazing team with a very well-led, Don Sacco was the CEO, and what an incredible person he is and was as a leader. And it was a company that understood its values. When in 1995, we joined with several other Blue Shield plans and Blue Cross plans in the Northwest to form the Regents Group. Then it was interesting to see how the various cultures, if you will, of the companies, both larger companies, million plus members, and smaller ones, how that all blended together. And that's where I really became I guess that early learnings helped me become a student of culture and corporate culture. And though I had a role in the new company as chief legal officer, what I really spent a lot of time on, aside in my spare time, shall we say, when I wasn't doing strictly legal work, was I really worked hard to bring the cultures of the organizations together, to figure out how we might do that, so that instead of having competing cultures and people trying to sort of make sure their cultural norms were the dominant one in the organization, to try to create certainly a person-centered culture for the entire organization. And I spent a lot of time, was involved in a culture building process that we called Act One, and spent a lot of time, in my spare time, developing that and being a leader in conducting culture building seminars for the employees across the footprint of the company. Was an incredible opportunity, and one that I think I grew an enormous amount from that, in being a teacher and in service to employees, and really getting to know people across the footprint of the company. Anyway, what I found was that generally it was a very good, now larger company, that wanted to do the right thing, but was more bureaucratic in nature, which is not unusual in companies that are well established and older. They are set in their ways. They reflected, I think, the broader reality in healthcare that I see in all sectors, which is it's more about setting rules, following rules, and enforcing rules on our customers. And while people believe that they're trying to be in service to individuals and families, all too often they believe the way to serve them is to quote them what the rules are and help them follow them. And that's not, in my book at least, real servant leadership. That's more of a bureaucratic form of leadership, or I'm not sure it's even leadership. It's safe. It's playing it safe. And so when I had the opportunity to become CEO first of Regence Blue Cross Blue Shield of Oregon, and then the what is now the Cambia organization, I wanted to change that. I wanted to move away as much as possible from that more bureaucratic, rules setting, rules following culture to one that was really kind of had an intimate focus on individuals, a deep curiosity about them and their families, and then tailoring solutions to help them navigate, probably in many cases, an unhappy or scary time for them. I often would say to our employees, we have the unique honor of serving people when they're not at their best. And we need to appreciate that, be grateful for it, and serve them well in that. And if we do that well, we're going to do well. And we're going to do well by them. And that's really, there's a lot to that, Denny, in terms of the journey, because that was a pretty big turn.
I would imagine.
Yeah. And I really, as a leader, I experienced what somebody once quoted a Gandhi quote to me that really spoke to me, because I experienced it, which was, if you want to change fundamentally a situation, you will find that first, and this is how he said it, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you. And I think he meant kind of in a sneering, sort of dismissive way. And then they fight you, and then you win. And I think that's true for transformational leadership and transformational leaders. It is not for the faint of heart. It is not for those without significant, I think, faith and a sense of perseverance, because I have found that is exactly what a bureaucracy or a culture will do when really challenged to change, because people don't really like to change. And they'll smile and they'll nod and they'll say, "Oh, isn't that great?" And one of the things that when I became CEO, there had been this succession of sort of what I would call strategies of the day that might last for a year, sometimes not even a year, because I think the overarching strategy was to survive, to meet new regulations, to adapt to them, and survive. And so that I think everyone seemed to understand that it was about that and not losing a lot of money, trying to break even or do a little bit better than that. And so that if mid-year something came along that kind of threatened that, then whatever the quote strategy was, it would be kind of put aside and we would just focus on that. Not unusual, again, for a long, like an older company, but also not a great way to live, not very inspiring. And so I wanted to, again, change that to creating a cause for the company and a set of strategies that would stand the test of time and would be something that were big enough that you would have to hold on to them over time in order to accomplish them. And so one of the first challenges was just getting employees to believe that the new cause and core strategies were one for real and not going to revert back to, oh no, let's make sure that we at least break even. But also that they were something that would be truly inspiring and hard to achieve, and that we would stick with them. I am proud to say that we set a cause and 4 core strategies in year 1 at the very beginning of my tenure, and they are the same now, 18 years later. And it's because they were something that were a reach, and they were something that people really cared about and over time came to believe in. And that's why I say over time, because people will nod and smile, but until they say that they have that sense of ownership of the strategy, it's not Mark's strategy, it's not the board strategy, that they can feel it and they have a sort of a fierce connection to it, then you really haven't even taken that first step to achieving it. And that took a while. That took a few years, because there was that ignoring, then laughing at it, then fighting me, even going to the board. Even there were a couple people that were so focused on it that instead of just leaving the company because they didn't like it, they tried to go around. They made an assumption that the board was not aligned with the management team and with me. And they thought if they went to the board and told them what was really going on, the board would take action to protect the company. Well, they were the only ones that were out of step. And when they went to the board was like, looked at them and said, well, yeah, what's the issue? And fortunately, at that point, those couple of individuals, they left the company, and we were able to move forward. But it did get to that point where people finally, they stopped the guerrilla warfare and actually took the gloves off and came out kind of publicly. But that's what happens when you're trying to really change something, is that people will believe that somehow the company is going to go off the rails. So it was a very interesting, I learned a lot in that process, and it actually kind of, in times it was very scary or frustrating, but it was ultimately very satisfying to see the company turn and to really embrace a different future.
Well, it's very gratifying too to have someone go to your board under the assumption that the board was in the same place they were, and in reality, the board had embraced the strategy. You had worked with the board, you were working with the company, and you were able to affect those changes.
Yeah, and Denny, if I could say, because I saw that Janice Karen asked a question about, was there something specific that helped folks get more on board? And I would say, what I have found about leadership in changing culture is that it usually isn't a single silver bullet. That one of the jobs of a CEO or any leader at any level, because you're all leaders, and so you have different places in which you lead in the company, and you can never pass the buck up. That's one of the things I would say is the biggest mistake that sometimes leaders who are not in the number one, or maybe will be several levels below the CEO, will think that they're not powerful that they don't have the power to make the change. And I will say that when I look back on my career, I think part of the reason I became CEO was because I never bought into that. And I kind of put my job on the line every day, which I think we're all called to do if we're leaders. We have to be willing to take the risk of losing our jobs to do what we think is right, and to work, try to help the company be the best it can be. And and don't ever underestimate that in yourself to be that kind of light for a company. But I will say that what I found as CEO, there are so many different personalities, so much diversity in a large organization. Ours was 5,000 employees. Maybe some of you are with even larger companies. And so how a CEO speaks and teaches, I guess you could say, and models that behavior, you have to do it in multiple different ways. You always have to be 100% consistent in the message and 100% consistent in one's own behavior and the way that one conducts themselves. There can't be a Mark Gans after 5 o'clock and a Mark Gans, at 8 in the morning till 5. I mean, you have to be authentic and be real, because people can see right through it. And I certainly always could. So I was like, why try to put on a mask? Just be who you are, and be unafraid of being who you are. And if it isn't good enough for the organization, then you shouldn't be leading it anyway. So, but I had to be super creative in terms of understanding that. What I remember is, like, an example was, and then this is a generalization, and it's always unfair to be generalizing, but I have found that different divisions in the company had a personality, that the kind of people who chose to do a particular kind of work in their life, there were some similarities, shall we say, in those who chose a particular professions within the healthcare profession. And they thought differently. Some people were more left brain and analytical, and others were more creative and maybe more drawn to the inspiration and more of the emotional piece. That's all valuable. But if the CEO only speaks in one voice, in a monotone that addresses only people that are like him or her, they're going to miss everyone else. It's one of the reasons that I'm very down on CEOs who get really big and taking public stands on big issues of the day, because those big issues of the day they're symptoms of something deeper. And that I always felt that the important thing to do was to speak to that deeper place in people and call them to be their very best there. That I had no right to disenfranchise people based on my opinion about something. We overestimate how much people really care about, quote, our opinion. And so it was, back, Janice, to your point, it was about trying to be really curious and sensitive to, how people receive information. And I'll tell you, I never got it right, because I would find it sometimes after almost any meeting, if I had an 80% batting average of people who really felt like the meeting went well and spoke to them, I figured that was pretty good, because there was always going to be a lot of people who might wanted to receive the information in a different way. So I would just try different things in different ways. And it was, sometimes it was written, sometimes it was verbal, sometimes it was it was a lot of personal, being out there, not hiding out in my office. But the key was consistency as to the values of the company, and being unashamed to talk about them and connect them to the people we serve, not just have them be like words. And consistency on our cause and consistency to our strategies, and then being very open about how we were doing. And one of the things that I hope none of you are in corporate communications, but if you are, one of the biggest disservices you do to, your organization is if it's always good news, that there's always a polish on bad news. No. Perspective on bad news is good. Polish on bad news is bad. It's like, how can you celebrate the good if there's never really any bad? I mean, everyone knows that we're human organizations and we make mistakes, and sometimes really bad ones, and we hurt the very people we're here to serve. You got to tell the truth about that. You got to tell people what they already sense, but give perspective on it, and and help people forgive themselves for the mistakes that they make and help the organization forgive itself. And so it was about that too, truth telling and celebrating the things we did well and being straight up about the things where we didn't, and where there were times where, and then taking accountability and meaning it. I hope that answers your question, Janice. And I wish there was a silver bullet, but it was, to me, it's very much more nuanced.
Thank you for that, Mark. Coming to an organization as the CEO, or growing into the organization as the CEO, and bringing with you the values, the authenticity, the focus, consistency, relentlessly applied over time, this kind of approach speaks to your background and speaks to where you come from. Those are not virtues or values that spring from nowhere.
Right.
Could you talk a little bit about your background? And to start, could you talk about your father? We've had a chance to talk with you a couple of times about this, and this is a fascinating story. Perhaps you could share some of that story with us.
Okay. Well, my mom and dad grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, and then they moved out to Spokane after he finished medical school and actually medical school and internship. And he set up a family practice in Spokane. And, on a personal level, one of the things that I learned that I remember about my childhood is Dad never made a lot of money as a family physician. That's, as many of you know, that's probably the least well reimbursed of any of the specialties in healthcare. And Dad was we were a single earner family with 8 mouths to feed. And yet we never wanted for anything. There were a lot in terms of the needs in our lives, but and my parents saved. Dad started saving for our college. And he said, that's going to be your inheritance, will be a college education from the day we were born. And I remember we'd always go down to the bank as a family with Dad and, leading. I thought it was something right out of Mary Poppins, I think. But, we would go down to the bank on New Year's Eve. And, that's when Dad would kind of, there would be some transaction, but always related to our college fund that he was managing for us. And he wanted us to be involved and kind of see it growing over the years. And that was one of the rituals. But, he always, they were family first. And so it's been a very important influence on me as a father, which was, especially in the profession or the job that I had, which I could have spent every day, every night out at some event. And I didn't. Leslie and I were, the value of having that family dinner and, and talking about the day and talking about school or whatever with the kids. I also tried to make sure I made every one of my kids' major events and would miss sometimes, Blue Cross Blue Shield board meetings or other kinds of things that were things, because that always came first. So that was one of the most important lessons that I learned from my parents. I think the second one was that I learned this notion of life in service to others. And, I ran strong in both my parents. They didn't give a darn about economic, the economic status of their friends or anything like that. And, so I never grew up with any understanding of this, if you will, a caste system that afflicts certain parts of the country or certain people and certain families. That was another gift that they gave. With regard to my dad, I probably learned an enormous amount in terms of leadership. He was a very principled man, and he was principled, linked to an enormous amount of vision and courage of his convictions. And I saw the beauty of that because he was an amazing physician and how that played out with his care of his patients. But a reality of that was he ran against the conventions at times. And in Spokane, there was a very powerful Blue Shield plan led by a very dominating CEO, I guess might be the nicest thing I could say. um, and uh, and that CEO tended to punish people who didn't follow exactly the rules and conventions. And at that time, the conventions were very pro specialty and anti primary care. And it was because the board of that Blue Shield plan was dominated by specialists, heart surgeons and orthopedic surgeons and urologists and whatever. And what they wanted from the family practitioners and general practitioners in town was compliance with their rules. They wanted doctors, those primary care docs, to be basically first aid physicians. See the patient, determine what the diagnosis was, and immediately refer them to the specialist for treatment. Well, that wasn't Dad's philosophy about primary care. He was decades ahead of his time. He really believed and practiced the patient-centered medical home, and he meant it. And it came from the very center of his being. And, he had his own x-ray, he had his own lab, he delivered babies. It was one of the best parts of his practice. He did minor surgeries like tonsillectomies and hernia operations. And, he stayed within what his knowledge was. But he really felt like being able to be there. And even when he referred, which he had to refer patients a lot to, for more serious surgeries and the like, he scrubbed in on every patient's surgery. Like, he would be there because he felt it was important that the patient saw him as they went under general anesthesia and saw him as they came out of general anesthesia. And he was always willing to help the surgeon, even if it was just passing scalpels, whatever, but just being there to be there in support of his patient. Don't you wish your primary care docs did that today? Well, don't you wish they even came into the hospital to visit you? He did that religiously. Anyway, that was very powerful. And after church on Sunday, he would often take us to the hospital to do rounds with him. It'd be like one or two of us kids. And so at a very early age, I got a sense of what it was like to be with patients and in service to them, watch the fear in the families, watch how Dad tried to calm their fear, watching and experience patients who were dying or near death, and that whole experience. It was an incredible privilege. At times it was scary as a little kid, kind of frightening. And I'll never forget the smell of the hospital, if you know what I mean. And just how you respond to that. But boy, was it formative. Meantime, Dad was not staying in his lane as defined by the local Blue Shield plan and its CEO, who then started to come after him and had decided he was going to, since he couldn't get Dad to comply, he was going to run Dad out of practice. He's going to run him out of town. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. My dad realized that what he was up against, and also, did not take kindly to the kind of pointed reimbursement things that the plan was doing to him in an effort to run him out of town. And so he brought a lawsuit against the local Blue Shield plan. He didn't relish that idea. He was not a litigious man, but he was a principled man. And that lawsuit lasted for 10 years because what the response of the CEO of that Blue Shield plan was, I can outspend and outweight this guy, and I can bleed him dry and force him out of practice by simply doing everything possible to make this lawsuit go on and force him to spend money on lawyers and whatever. And my dad gritted it out. He called it Project Spokane. And I'll never forget it because it just seemed to be the time that lawsuit was in a very formative time for me. And so I had a real vision of how a corporation can just be a nasty weapon and can go after good people and try to damage them and use the power of that. So that case was resolved. Finally, a new general counsel came in who I think went to the CEO of that company and said, "You're never going to win this. You're on the wrong side of it. And this doctor is not going to let go. You should have learned that by now." um, and so they settled on terms that were favorable to Dad. It wasn't about money. It was about the principle of allowing him to practice the way that he believed in practicing, which was the right way to go. And also he won a victory for discrimination against all primary care docs in Spokane, none of whom really gathered by his side. They all were too afraid. And so they were afraid of the bigger company and they kept their distance from my dad, but yet ended up benefiting by it. So I learned something about being willing to go against convention, to be transformative, to make a difference. And that certainly has guided me. I'm very grateful to my dad for that example. Very sorry in some ways that happened, and sorry for the cost to him personally, because it really did cost him in many ways, not just in lawyers' fees. And it cost our family. There was a lot of tension at times in the family around that because it was hard.
We'll talk a little bit about, your father was invested in his legacy for you and your siblings being a college education. Talk a bit about college and your graduate education, because your father comes into the picture again as you're in the middle of this, as I remember.
Yeah, that's a tougher conversation or a tougher story. So yeah, I went to Georgetown University. I was when I flew to Georgetown for orientation and to start my time there, that was the first time I'd been east of the Idaho-Montana border. and that was, there was no going and visiting campuses at the time. You got a brochure. There was no internet. You could go and look at all kinds of pictures. I mean, I remember just when I arrived on campus on a very hot and humid Washington, D.C. day, I was like, what have I done? I had the wrong clothes. I had it was like coming to a new country. It was also one of the best things that ever happened. And my time at Georgetown, I'm just incredibly grateful for. Alex Drain, who's on here, knows that I learned, I was part of an a cappella singing group while I was there. And that was really fun. And I'd always been a musical person. And so that was a great adjunct. I also got a chance to work for our senator from Washington State, Senator Henry Jackson, Scoop Jackson. And I worked for him from my sophomore year until the beginning of law school when he passed away suddenly. And that was an enormously incredible experience to work for a truly good man and a real statesman who cared about me. Like he would come and visit me sometimes later in the evening because I worked, from 2:00 until 7:00 at night. And he would sometimes come visit me and we would talk about, he got me to change my major. I started as a philosophy major and he was the one that drilled into me that I should be a history major. And he had very good reasons for doing that. He was a real student of history. So then I decided, because I was working for Senator Jackson in part, I decided to stay and go to law school at Georgetown. And it was, I guess it was after my first year of law school. That summer, my oldest brother was ordained a Jesuit priest. And it was this incredible family time and wonderful, very happy time. But ironically, about 2.5 weeks after that happened, after all, the guests had left and family and all of that, my parents had a really bad fight. They were prone to having fights from time to time, as happens in any marriage. This one was a really bad one. And I was the only one living at home that summer because I was working at a law firm in Spokane. And my mom, for the first time, she left. She packed a bag and she got in her car and she drove to Seattle and she lived for about 3 months with one of my sisters. And that had never happened in their marriage. And I think she did it, and it worked from the perspective of issuing a wake-up call to dad. Some dynamics in their relationship that needed to change after many years. And I think it probably had to do with that transition from being young lovers with no children to then being parents and really taking that seriously, where, you know, the relationship goes from this to kind of like this, you know, with kids. And after the kids grow up, you have to learn how to come back like this. And it was right there where I think the tension was really, really tough. Anyway, so I had a very difficult summer because I was basically caring for my dad. He didn't know how to cook, and he was very lost, you know, from that, what had happened. And so I spent my summer pretty much kind of making sure that try to keep him mentally okay. I remember spending a lot of time trying to figure out like what we could do to kind of where I could take dad to get his mind, you know, off and keep him moving forward, and when he wasn't working. And I certainly I was his cook that summer for sure. Anyway, I went back to law school, and then we were called home for a family conference in mid-October. And that's when mom and dad came back together. But it was an odd family meeting. I never quite understood what happened there, but anyway, went back to law school. And about a month later, just around time of, you know, exams before Christmas, I got a letter from my dad and saying that any financial support he was providing me for law school, and I was doing most of it with loans, but he was providing this very important bridge. He was withdrawn immediately with there was no accounting for it. There was no reason given. It was just kind of this boom, very unexpected, and at a very bad time, because the next semester I was right in the middle of exams, and the next semester was coming. So I started scrambling to see if I could get some other loans. And those of you who are of similar age to me know that at that time in the early 80s, interest rates were through the roof, and the only loans I could get were at 15%. And so I was able to get one loan at 15%, but in addition to all the other loans I had, but I couldn't get any more loans. I would have been too leveraged. So I decided I was going to withdraw from the law school, and I was going to try to get a job in DC with a law firm as a clerk or something, and just try to earn some money so I could get back to law school at some point in the future. In that singing group I was in, there was a Jesuit priest who was a member of the group, and I confided in him one night, told him I was leaving, and the like. Well, about 3 days later, I got a call from the president's office of the university. The president at the time was Father Timothy Healy, and his somebody muted me. Said the host muted me. Sorry about that.
That may have been me by accident. My apologies. I'm staying clear of the keyboard.
Okay, but anyway, so he asked to see me, and so I went later that day, I guess. And I had done some leadership work, when I was an undergrad, and so I had met the president. I didn't know him really well, but I'd done some leadership things, and so our paths had certainly crossed. So I went into the office to see him, not knowing. I just assumed maybe he was going to ask me to do something, in leadership at the university and whatever. And he told me at that point that this other priest had come to him and told him of my situation. And the first thing he did was ask me if I needed any help, like someone to talk to. And he was just showed incredible empathy toward whatever I was going through. And I said, no, I think I'm okay. I said, sometimes I don't understand what my dad does, but that's been a lifelong thing. And I'm just, I'm going to get through it. So then he said, well, tell me about your situation. I hear you're going to withdraw from the law school. And I told him the situation, told him what my loans were. And he sort of said, well, so what's the difference? What's the bridge you can't build? And I told him the amount, and he said, he thought for a minute, and then he said, we'll take care of it. And I was like one of those moments, maybe you've had this, where somebody says something to you and you literally are so surprised you don't know what to, you're not even sure you heard it. And so I that was my reaction. I was like, huh? And he said, we'll take care of it. And I said, uh, and I wow. And I was, well, thank you. And I said, so who do I work with in terms of the loan documents? Because I assumed that they were making a loan. And I was incredibly grateful for that. But he said, no, no, no. And he kind of had this Irish smile that he cracked. And he said, no, you don't seem to understand, Mark. We'll take care of it. We're not going to lose you to the law school for the rest of your time here. You've been a leader in this school for a long time. I think you're going to make it a real difference in your life. And I want to make sure that you can. And I said, well, how can I pay it back? And he said, you don't get to pay this back. He said, I think you're going to be a successful person and you'll find a way to pay it forward. And that will be enough for this school and enough for me. And I will say that I think of Father Healy every day, and I thank him for that incredible unlooked for kindness. And it has been the most powerful force in my life, bar none. I mean, it always brings me back to this incredible sense of gratitude that I know that I can never repay. And I can only hope that, he's up there smiling down and feels like I've done a decent job of paying it forward so far. And I know that I will continue to do so for the rest of my life, because that's how I feel about it. I spoke about this for the first time at a graduation years later. I had a hard time telling that story for a long time. It's certainly not until after Dad had passed away. But my message to the graduates of Oregon Health and Science University at the time was that we all have faced, maybe in our own ways, those kinds of unlooked for gifts, all of us. And part of our job in life is to remember those and reflect on them and marvel at them. And then make it our business to do the same for others. And to never forget that sense of gratitude that we felt at the time. And frankly, if we cultivate it, I think the gratitude, the sense of it grows, the wonder at it grows. And I think one of the real strengths of my life and as a leader and a father and a husband has been that moment, because that's the one that was kind of I'd learned many lessons as a child, but there was something about that seminal event that just has been it's led me places I never thought I would go.
Well, one of the things very important, but certainly not the most important, that derived from that experience and from your own sense of self, your own evolution, and development as a person is this sense of purpose as a leadership philosophy, this sense of service. You talk about work as service. You talk about that it's a privilege to do the work that you do.
It is.
How did you lead the organization that way? You talked a bit earlier about it, but there is something about being a servant leader or being driven by purpose that can inspire people more than being driven by economics or driven by competitiveness or driven by any other force. How did you call upon that to actually bring about the change that Cambia and its predecessor organization that you did? I mean, what were some of the things? You talked a bit about them, but where you engaged people in this manner, where you took those lessons to bear in leading up?
Well, maybe I'll start by, maybe since everyone who's on this call is here not just to hear my story, but hopefully have it be something that in some small way, you'll take a few pearls and can be useful in your journey as leaders. So maybe I'll start with that, with trying to go there first, which I guess would be we don't own our jobs. Our jobs, if we're given a job, whatever it may be, it's a privilege to have it, especially if it's a leadership role. And that we only really honor that privilege if we don't hang on to it. I remember when Leslie and I were married, my brother Rick, who was a priest by then, he said our wedding. And I'll never forget his homily, his sermon, if you will, at the wedding, which was, he talked about love. He told a story that the moral of the story was that love is best understood when it's held with open hands. And that when people try to claim the other as theirs, when they try to close their hands around their love, is when they lose it. Because that love and the giving of love and receiving of love is something that is an act of freedom, not an act of ownership or clutching. And that's been a really powerful concept in not only in our marriage. It was a beautiful thing that I've often thought of, but I have found it to be an absolute truism in any kind of relationship or any kind of thing that we love. If it's our job that we love, the way to respond to that is never to claim it or clutch at it and try to save it. That's when you lose it. It's that ability to try to lead always with those sense of open hands. And that's what I meant earlier when I said putting your job on the line every day, being prepared to lose it, to do something in service to the people that you're here to serve. So that would be one thing that I would say is maybe one of the very most important concepts in what makes, I think, an effective leader versus one that's less effective or not effective. The second concept I would share with you that I think has served me well is the capacity and the skill, I guess I would say, of learning to make decisions with your heart, not your mind. At the end of the day, we're in service to people, to individuals and families. We're in service to our coworkers, to the people who report to us. They're not there as minions and, to help us be successful. It's quite the opposite. We're there to serve, to help make them the best they can be. And the best way that I have found to do it is to consistently reflect on the notion and learn to make decisions with my heart more than my mind. Every one of us who are in positions of leadership or have been successful in our lives, and I suspect everyone on this call is, we all have a certain native intelligence. We're smart. We did well in school. We worked hard. I have found that there's little to distinguish between one smart person versus another smart person. And there's little to value in somebody being a genius versus being just kind of smart. Most important thing is, how have they developed their heart? How are they at making decisions there? Because there's a lot of really smart people who have made a lot of really bad decisions by rationalizing a bad decision, rationalizing themselves to a bad decision. It happens all the time. Companies do it collectively. Boards do it. And so what I practiced a lot, and I think I learned it just from maybe a little bit from my parents, but a lot from, for example, the act that Father Healy made for me, which was clearly a decision of the heart, that it was worth spending the time to learn how to do it, because it's like any exercise. You have to get good at it. It's not one that comes naturally. It's one you have to work at, and you have to work at it with small decisions and small acts. And then it prepares you for the really tough decisions. And I have found often that the hardest decisions I've had to make have oddly been relatively straightforward for me. Like they just appeared. I knew what we needed to do. I knew what I needed to do. And it was because it came from here. If I got all up in here, then I'd get all confused, making a list of the pros and the cons. Sometimes that can be helpful, but only if it helps you get access to the decisions of your heart. And I also find that when you do that, you tend to make a decision that is in favor of others. It's for the betterment of others as opposed to the betterment of yourself. Those are the two most important concepts I would share in leadership, because I think one of the other fun things about what happens when you make decisions from your heart, it'll test you. You'll be more likely to be courageous and be making a courageous decision, one that might cost you personally. But at the end of the day, you will feel so much better about because you did it that way. And that's what I would say I've tried to do in my career. Have I been 100 bad? Do I have a batting average of 100%? Hell no. Wish I did, but I don't think that's possible. Maybe, but I'll bet you that my batting average, I know that I didn't remain as CEO for 18 years because I was good at protecting my job. No way. I think I was good at doing it. And I think the reason I earned the right to continue for 18 years and then be able to turn the company over to Jared, in a graceful fashion, was because I did take, I guess you could say, personal risk. I didn't try to protect my job. I tried to do the job as best as I knew how. And so that the mistakes I made, and I made plenty, were smaller mistakes. They weren't the big ones.
We seem to be in an industry today that is on, it always seems that we're perched on the edge of something. But right now, we have federal regulations that are requiring health plans and healthcare providers, whether they're hospitals or physicians, to work much more closely together than they used to. Rather than being contractual adversaries, they need to come up with a way to collectively care for patients in a manner that is both of high quality, good outcomes, cost effective. But there's a lot of prevailing antagonism. There's a lot of prevailing mistrust. Mm-hmm. While other organizations are creating new models that can threaten the future of some of the incumbents. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about, when you look at the industry, when you look at the revolution in data, when you look at the increasingly, though still gradual, increasing number of at-risk or value-based contracts that hospitals and physicians are assuming, payers and providers, the payviders, as they call them, coming into the marketplace. Could you talk a little bit about, from your philosophy, where you see this market and what you see as its vulnerabilities, and what you see as its path to delivering better healthcare than we deliver today?
Yeah. Well, one thing I would say is that it's I've spent a lot of time with a lot of different leaders in different sectors of healthcare, and noticed a couple of things. First off, there's a real consistency that has developed, and this was not true 18 years ago, but it has developed now, where people will readily acknowledge that the system is broken, that the economic model is not a sustainable one, that the human service model is not where it needs to be, and there's an increasingly more authentic understanding, of, look, we're all here to serve individuals and families. We're not here to serve populations. To talk about populations is a dodge of real responsibility and accountability. It's a notion, it's founded in this prevailing notion that those of us in healthcare are smarter than the people we serve. And if we can just get them to do what we need, what we know is right, then all will be well. And there's still a lot of that, but I'd say that I'm seeing more amongst at least CEOs of people who are moving past that or trying to move past that. But where the rub is that there's two rubs, I guess. One is there's a lot of passing of the buck. There's a lot of saying, well, if that other part, that other company or that other type of company in healthcare, if they would make the change, then I can make the change. The biggest one that I see a lot is the great dodge is, well, if I got reimbursed for it, I'd do it. Well, there's multiple situations of where all I have to do is just come up with them. And it's like, oh, yep, check the box. Yep. Where things have been reimbursed and nothing changed because there wasn't a desire or even a competence to change. End of life care would be a good example. And the way that people are dealt with regard to palliative care, which is so important to the curative process, the healing process. It's what turns a cure into a healing. And it needs to happen more consistently. Right now, we have a system that's focused on cure. And a cure is a good and a death is bad. It's that simple. And people have forgotten, physicians and certainly hospitals and others have forgotten that it's about affecting a healing that's important. And that's hopefully most of the time, an aspect of the healing is a cure. But an acknowledgement that sometimes a cure is not going to be possible and that a healing can still be affected even without a cure. And so the passing of the buck, this notion of someone else needs to change before I can change, just it's too commonplace in healthcare, and that needs to change. I try to be an example of that and have our company be an example of not blaming others, but trying to be the change we wanted to see, to loosely quote Gandhi again. Because I think that's the only way that we're going to really make change. The second thing I would say that inflicts healthcare is that boards. I'm going to start with boards and not just lay it off on other CEOs, but I think it's both. But I think that we have a lot of boards in healthcare that are too long in the tooth. They've been around too long. It's been too much of a club. Or worse, or maybe as bad, is that the relationship between the board and the management team, even if the board has evolved some, still isn't right. It's management going to the board, presenting PowerPoint plans, and going for the motion and the second and the vote, as opposed to what the better use of a board is recognizing that if you construct the right board, they become an enormous resource to the management team, and that the management team uses a board best, since we're paying them, to listen more and talk less, to present the kind of difficult strategic issues we're dealing with, and ask for the board's perspective and help in how we think about it. And a board, when invited to do so, isn't going to cross the line and start micromanaging the management team. The board is going to be an even more powerful resource to the work of the company. And that's what I feel was one of my sort of more, if you want, a concrete thing that I did in the company that I think will last for, a very long time, is we created a board management dynamic that does that. We don't take fully baked bread to the board anymore. Other than maybe the budget at the very, at the end of the year, the operating budget. But it's really about engaging all through the year on the most difficult issues we're dealing with strategically, in terms of deciding, the pace, the timing of bringing something to market, trying to shape a new product. And if more companies in healthcare got better at that, I think we would see a faster turn, a faster transformation. When I talk with CEOs a lot, and they kind of say, well, how did you get your company moving? How did you get to such a more innovative place? And I said, I talk about this, and then a lot of times what they'll say is, well, I know my board, I can't get my board to do that. And I will sort of smile and say, have you tried? Like, have you really tried? And what are you doing to change the board out? If the board is not taking the company where you need to go, what are you doing to get board members who can help you? And then it's like, there's not enough either value placed on that, and not enough maybe courage placed in that direction. And I think that's a huge issue, which then perpetuates this sort of passing of the buck. It's, well, I can't get my board to do it, or I can't get that other player in healthcare to do it. And so then what happens is we get back to this very corporate view, which is, well, then maybe we should just merge. Maybe we should just get bigger. And I call it the dinosaurs. It's like, there's this sense that this asteroid's coming, don't know really much about it, but right now I'm just going to make sure that I get to be a bigger dinosaur. And I just sort of say, yeah, but you're still a dinosaur, and the asteroid is still coming. And I feel like that's what's going on in healthcare. The asteroid's coming. We cannot sustain economically the model we have. And so just becoming a bigger dinosaur doesn't solve the problem. And yet that's where I think a lot of boards and CEOs spend an awful lot of their time, is talking about getting bigger. And then promising themselves, and worse, promising the unsuspecting public, that all will be well. We'll serve patients better because we're, 3 times the size we are. And guess what? The facts bear out that doesn't happen. And then worse, that, and I've lived through it, is that the culture then turns in on itself, because you're trying to put two cultures together, and they're different, and they have different kind of value sets, different things that are important, and they're trying to win their own battles. And guess who loses? The very people we're here to serve. So I'm not negative on mergers don't get me wrong when I say that. It's just, we focus in the wrong places too much, and the balance gets out of whack. And it's the very people we're here to serve, the reason we exist as companies, that then they're the ones that get hurt in the process. And that's when I talk about, more courageous leadership. I hope everyone on this call feels like you're not powerless in this. Because wherever you exist in your organization, you can start making a difference in how the organization thinks and makes decisions. And don't underestimate the influence that will have all the way to the C-suite, if you're not in the C-suite, and even to the board. And if you get the opportunity to present to your board, for example, maybe that's not something you do every day, but you do get that opportunity, don't miss the opportunity to challenge the board. You'll be noticed. And that's important. It's not about you getting noticed. It's about you being an influence for the better in your organization. And all I'm saying is I know you might look at that and say, yeah, well, it's easy for him to say he was the CEO. I wasn't always the CEO, and that's the key. I see Ferris Taylor asked a question about, at some point you might share your perspectives on whether for-profit belongs in healthcare. You touched on a reimbursement issue, but is for-profit motivation more fundamental? Ferris, I did mention that earlier, where I talked about why personally, we are staunchly not-for-profit as a company, but we are full tax-paying not-for-profit. I think that nonprofit tax-dodging organizations have no place in healthcare. I'll just be that blunt. I am tired of it, and it needs to end. Hospital organizations that claim the tax deduction, the enormous tax break they get from taxpayers, and salt, profits away, and then sort of say, oh yeah, but we are, we do good public things, we give charity. Well, I've had too many hospital CEOs who have told me that, the health insurance company needed to reimburse them more to cover that charitable commitment that they had to cover. In other words, they didn't really believe in that as being part of their deal, because they had a margin they needed to cover, that a profit margin they wanted to make. Well, it's a sickness. If I were czar for a day, I would eliminate overnight the tax deduction in healthcare, that, a hospital is not big brothers and big sisters. It's not Red Cross. They're different. They're corporate organizations. If they want to be not for profit, God love them. I want them to be. We are. I also believe they should pay their full measure of taxes. That's just plain and simple. So that's my first principle. The second principle is that not-for-profit has to be a value-driven thing. It's not just a corporate form. And so you have to know why you want to be not-for-profit. And so it's not about dodging taxes. It's not about, it doesn't give you license to be less than a super efficient, well-run organization. We have a job to do, and we have people to serve, and we need to serve them and we need to be buttoned up about it, and we need to be very highly professionalized. It's never an excuse to say, well, we're not for profit, so we don't have to be as attending to these things. No, you do. You do. That's about being the best you can be. So it has to be something that's driven from the sense of, why are you in it? Now, I don't have a problem with the notion of physicians, for example, or dentists being, quote, for profit. I mean, they're individual businesses and they need to feed their families and the like. So I think there's places in healthcare and types of organizations that it's perfectly fine to be a for profit. I'm much more curious about what the values are that drive that. Why are you in it? What are you hoping to accomplish? What are you willing to do in service to the people you're there to serve, to put them first always, as opposed to your own needs? My brother is a neurosurgeon. He has run across colleagues that are in other specialties in healthcare in his community that some of the stories he's shared with me are appalling, where, physicians put themselves in front of their patients. There's a particular case going on in that community right now where a physician refused to treat a patient because they were too busy with their own personal things. And the delay in treatment, a high school kid died because he didn't get the treatment because this doctor didn't, refuse to, quote, accept the patient. And that kind of putting yourself ahead of the others is just antithetical to what we should be in healthcare. Anybody who's in healthcare has to be for others. And if you're not, then get out of healthcare, do something else. So it's less about the for-profit, not-for-profit. To me, it's more about why are you doing it? When I meet with entrepreneurs, for example, in healthcare that are trying to build something new, the thing I'm most interested in as an investor or a mentor is, why are you doing what you're doing? And if they're simply trying to get their hypodermic needle, if you will, into the artery of healthcare payments so they can personally benefit from that, if they're just trying to come up with a new way to steer some of that enormous amount of cash flow toward their thing and their personal comfort, then I have no interest in working with them or investing in them. If they are really guided by trying to fundamentally transform healthcare to make it more person-focused and economically sustainable model in this country for individuals and their families, and that's what drives them, and they really are authentic about it, and they're willing to take the risk to achieve it, okay, that's worth investing in. And I don't care if they're a for-profit. If that's what they're trying to do, boy, I'm all for helping them.
All the power to them.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's an awful lot of, quote, what I call fake innovation going on in healthcare. It's the former, not the latter. It's people who are just they're interested in money. and then they see that
Right.
there's a lot of money in healthcare. So how can I get some? And they come up with, quote, an innovation, which is really just about profiting off of the brokenness of the system as it exists today and not changing it. And I think that we need to collectively search our souls about that, and two, call it out when we see it.
One of the areas that you've talked about where this seems to be borne out is in the area of prior authorization. We talked a little bit about that in one of our meetings. I'm not seeing all the questions that are coming across the board either. So if you're getting questions too, by all means, Mark.
Yeah, I'm just looking at it in the chat, and just because if it comes up in the flow, I'm just trying to jump on it, and would urge people, if there's a question, is just, that makes this more conversational, which is really, I guess I'm here to serve you guys here, not the other way around.
Well, we're going to ask folks to type questions that you have into the chat box. And if you want to unmute your microphone, you can either raise your hand or type that into the chat box, and we'll let your questions come through that way. Okay. But while we wait for those questions to come through, prior authorization is an issue that's got everybody on both the health plan side and the provider side, aware of the fact that there is an administrative burden. But there's a lot of difference about how to fix it. We're a data company. Our focus is on making sure organizations have the best data, that they know how to use data, that they use data for the purposes of simplifying and improving healthcare. But prior authorization is a tough nut to crack. And we talked about it some in our prior conversations. You want to talk a little bit about that as a case, sort of a case in point, if you will, what you were talking about before?
It is a good case in point because it's one of the most difficult nuts to crack. I mean, first off, there's a reason that prior authorization started, in the first place. It was solving a very real, it was a response to a very real problem. And that was that people, physicians, or even at times we ran into organizationally, like hospital organizations who were commanding their physicians to practice in a certain way, go through certain hoops, and that were designed to maximize revenue as opposed to treat the patients well. And so prior authorization was created. I don't know who created it, but it was created as a way of trying to, I guess, create a Hawthorne effect to stop the nonsense. And so it was a way of saying, hey, you got to run this by us first. We're going to take a look at it, and we're going to put some friction into the system so that it slows down, the runaway train, if you will, of overdoing and over-treating. So it came from I guess you could say, a necessary place. There was nothing sinister about whoever created it as a means of trying to control unnecessary healthcare usage and spending. Problem is that as it took root, and I don't think this was an intended consequence, but it's a very real consequence, which is it puts the patient and their family right in the middle of the dispute. And so that the often the real friction point is where it was intended to be, was on the provider. Instead, what happens, it's on the patient, because what happens is the physician or whoever, a hospital, promises the patient that they need this particular procedure to get healthy. And so the patient gets emotionally attached to the idea that they're going to have this particular treatment, whether it's a drug treatment or a surgery or whatever it might be. And they convince themselves they need it because their doctor has told them they need it. And then the health plan tells them not so fast. And then in that case, do you think the provider is going to say to the patient, oh, the health plan was right, I was wrong? We'll bygones be bygones. Thanks for the help from Blue Cross. No, they're going to say that damn insurance company is getting in the way of your treatment. And even if the health plan is right, they're always wrong. And it just, it's not, it has been, it is not, it may be accomplishing part of its purpose, but it's creating a whole new bevy of problems. And so I think that there's an increasing realization that there's got to be a better way. There's a better way to solve the problem of overtreatment and overuse that is really harmful to patients, both in their pocketbook and in their body. But do it in a way that doesn't create the friction point at the patient level, but that creates a greater degree of transparency and accountability. Ultimately, I think all of us know instinctively that in a normal situation in our lives, when somebody tries to, is consistently trying to over-treat you, I'm not talking about healthcare now, whether it's an auto mechanic or an auto dealer, or, you name your other service provider, the plumber that comes to fix your toilet, and then suddenly you've got 10 problems, not one, and he's got a solution for all of them. Your own horse sense says, wait a minute. And people like that don't last in business very long if they do that consistently. And because the word gets out, and now with social media, word gets out quickly. But in healthcare, because of the payment model, we seem to accept the notion that we don't need to be, that lack of transparency is sort of normal, as opposed to highly abnormal. I believe that of creating a system in which the healthcare provider is directly accountable to the person they serve, both in terms of the quality of what they provide and what they charge for it. And that where we need to create more focus is in that, because I happen to believe that the average consumer, the individual, and their family members can figure out what they need to figure out to hold accountable the people who provide the service to them. They do in every other aspect of their lives, and sometimes in very, very complicated things. Think about people's experience with technology, or how they pay for their legal services or their accounting services. I mean, we figure out what we need to figure out as individuals. But in healthcare, there's this view of, no, you don't have to. In fact, you should.
Learned helplessness on the part of the patient.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that we need to get away from. We don't solve that by going taking even more control away from individuals. I think what real respect of the individual looks like to me is that you actually trust them and you give them the information they need and be their partner in helping them navigate the system, not be their rule maker and rule enforcer. So there's, where we were experimenting as a company, and that will be left to my successor and his team to continue to figure out is there a better way than prior auth? And it's not just about doing prior auth and using digital solutions to speed it up. I mean, that would be nice in the near term, is to make it more efficient and not having a prior auth take 2 weeks or a week or even 3 days. When my brother had a very bad accident, my oldest brother, the one who's a priest, there came a point where it was time for him to be discharged from the ICU, and he needed to go to a very, an inpatient rehab facility. And we had to go through a prior authorization process to extract him from the hospital. And we found through the sweat of our brow a good place that could take him, and did all of our homework, and I'm kind of taking the lead on it. So I don't lack in a certain sophistication about how healthcare works and how I prior auth. I got to tell you, that was such a painful experience, even for me, because I could tell that just the wheels were churning slowly, and no one really cared about my brother, as an individual. They didn't see him as an individual. They didn't know that if we didn't get that authorization by the certain time, he would lose that bed in that rehab facility because someone else was going to get there ahead of him.
Right.
And I, it was a struggle to figure that out. So I know that it's a painful, and there's just got to be a better way. And and it's still something to be. I mean, I would have liked, first off, as I said, it would have been nice if they had done it within 24 hours. That's, that would be a good start, but that isn't the ultimate fix, because prior authorization, I still think, is not the best way to solve the problem for the long term.
We have a number of questions that have come up. I think, Janice, you have 2 questions that were waiting to be asked. Is that correct?
Yes. So there are 2 questions, and if additional folks want to ask, feel free to message them either publicly or to me. And it looks like there is something else in the chat window. But the 2 questions that are in the queue, one of them was from towards the beginning, and I think that so the question as written was, you mentioned that there were times at which this change was scary. What were some of those "oh no, what have I done" moments? How did you keep your values and keep course? I assume this is talking about the change to a person-centric model. If whoever wrote this question, I didn't get it directly. If that's not what you meant, please chime in.
Well, I'll be kind of funny and say, well, there were times where, when I was like repopulating our board or just bringing on new leaders, there were times where I said, "Oh no, what have I done?" Because you think you got it right, and then you realize, "Oh, that didn't work out the way I would hoped it would work out," and then you have to navigate from there and try to fix it. I certainly can remember those moments. With regard to the kind of challenges I faced with respect to really trying to move the culture, I had a really wise board member tell me early on. He said that, when I was just freshly minted as the CEO, and he said, "Mark," and he was a longtime CEO, he said, "the thing that you're going to find over your career, however long it lasts, is the most difficult thing you're going to have to figure out is how to manage pace, the pace of change." Because he could tell I was going to be one that was going to drive change. And that was part of the reason the board chose me at the time that they chose me. Because I certainly wasn't. I guess what I would say is I was very young. I was 40 when I became the CEO of the Oregon company, and 42 when I became CEO of Cambia. I was by far the youngest person ever to be chosen as a leader of this company, and on the young side generally. So the board, and I had infant kids at the time. So there was this notion of like, there was a lot of concern, I think, amongst board members. They made the choice, but they were obviously concerned about how I was going to balance everything. And I was younger, but he mentioned this notion of pace. And I will say that has been, he was dead right. I think it's a worthy discernment in any of your jobs and what you do wherever you are in your companies, is to always be challenging yourself on the issue of how fast are you trying to push change. First off, I would hope that you're always trying to push change and that you don't view your job as being a mere functionary just to make sure that, whatever job you assume, that you don't screw it up. That's not a good model. I would never say that that's a good advice to say, yeah, just don't screw it up. I actually think you're going to screw it up at times. And if you're not screwing it up, you're like the skier that's afraid to fall. And guess what? You'll never be a good skier if you are afraid to fall. You have to push it. It's the only way you learn. So I just think that you should have a lot of those "oh no" kind of times where you're really saying, I don't know how this is going to turn out, but we're just going to go for it. And you have to instill that in the people that you lead, so that it's not just on you, but they're willing to do that, and that they see their job as, they're not doing their job by simply maintaining their job. The only way they do their job well is they're constantly transforming it. When people ask, well, how did you get to be CEO? I always say, one, honor the job you're given. Don't do somebody else's job. Don't daydream about your next position, because the moment you do that, you're not paying attention to the job you're being paid to do. So honor the job you're given, but don't be limited by the job description on paper. Transform the job to something more than anyone ever in the company could have imagined it could be. And if you do that, you'll be a happier leader and employee, and the company will be better because you were in that role. Biggest mistake people make is they do a role and then they get bored with it and they say that, oh, I need a new role. No, you should never get bored with the role you're given if you're doing it the right way. You should always be changing it and making it something that isn't boring, because you're transforming it. And you can do that in any role that you are in a company. The biggest maybe one oh no I would say that I made was when I was general counsel. I started our ethics and compliance program. This was back in the mid 90s for the company, and had not had an ethics and compliance program before that. And I started it up and the like, and became the first ethics and compliance officer. And there was a very senior leader in the company who was senior to me in the pecking order, who was doing bad things. The only way to describe it, was misusing their power to benefit themselves, and we're doing it in a number of different ways, in a number of different instances, and then intimidating employees around that person in order to be able to create a safe zone for misbehaving. And apparently got away with it for years. And just kind of the more they got away with it, the more they kind of pushed the envelope slowly. And they were in a powerful enough position where they were able to create a vortex around them. Well, one very brave employee reported on that person to me. And when I began investigating, it just was like, you've got to be kidding. Oh, you've got to be kidding. Oh, you've got to be, there's one more thing. And so then I knew that to pursue this for me was potentially career limiting, if not ending in the company. And I had to make a decision. And I remember talking with my wife about it. And I was like, I've got to do this. So we completed the investigation. I took it to the CEO, who I reported to, and laid it out. And he said, yep, this is a problem. I'll take care of it. Well, he didn't like conflict a whole lot. He was a very principled guy, but he didn't like conflict. And so I said, okay, he said he would take it. Well, about a week later, my phone rings and it's the individual who was doing the bad things. And that person got me on the line, and to use a rich term, he attempted to rip me a new one. He just absolutely just blasted me and threatened me both personally and physically even. And I'll never forget his final line, which was, if you ever do something like this again to me, I will personally come down to Portland. I will rip your heart out. And I will never forget that saying, because the intensity of it was just unbelievable. And when I started to sort of like come back, he slammed the phone down. That was the end of the conversation. And I thought for a moment there after I caught my breath, and I was like, I got really angry. And I thought, I knew that my CEO had booted it. He had soft pedaled it and had allowed it to be sort of, yeah, well, Mark, he's kind of he's a little bit too zealous about these things. Well, all that kind of thing, which gave permission essentially to this guy calling and trying to threaten me out of existence. And so I got up and I walked down the hall and I went into the CEO's office unannounced. And I said, I challenged him. I said, what, let me tell you about the phone call I just received. And when I finished telling that story, he kind of shook his head. And I said, he only did that because you gave him tacit permission to do so. And I said, I'm going to continue this investigation because I don't think this person belongs in the organization. They're a cancer. And obviously I think, obviously I need to do more investigation to convince you of that. That's what I said. I walked out. And, 2 weeks later, he was terminated. But I really felt like I was going to lose my job, that I was taking an enormous risk And that was certainly an oh no moment. But yet when I look back, it's one of the moments I'm most proud of, not because I cost somebody their job. No, I never relished any of the, that, but because it was a cancer in the organization and it needed to stop. And I was willing to put the organization and its needs ahead of my own career. And oddly, I actually think that in the long run, that may have been a turning point in how the CEO viewed me, and his support for me maybe being a broader leader in the organization long term, because he turned out to be one of my biggest champions. I didn't know it at the time, but it turned out he was when there was discussion about who should succeed him. So anyway, that might be an example. And the reason I tell that story is I bet every one of you have faced those kinds of moments in your career where you were like really up against it. And I would just hope that, and if you haven't yet, you will, I promise you. And I just hope that you always put that, put your own career needs second to that, because I think actually the irony is if you do, your career will probably go to places you never expected in a good way in the long run.
Great.
Thank you
There
for
are
that,
actually
Janice.
Yep, there are three more questions now. The next one is about when you were talking about the concept of healing as opposed to curing someone.
Yeah.
Do you see the concept of healing as the goal of healthcare separate and distinct from a cure, as an emotional thing, a psychological thing, a religious thing? Is it acceptance of reality when a cure isn't possible? Some people may think that it's a nebulous, undefinable thing. What do you mean by it, and why is it important?
Good question. Well, if you read the Hippocratic Oath, it doesn't talk about cure as being what a physician signs up to do, and what they recite at their graduation from medical school when they recite the oath in a very solemn way. It's about effecting a healing. And I see most health care providers being trained to effect a cure. And it's always about that. And I'll give you an example that impacted my family. And that was when my mother was in her last days, as she had congestive heart failure. She had a couple of heart attacks. She'd had a minor stroke. And she knew she was near the end of her life. She was a person of deep faith and was very much at peace with. She wanted to live every day that she lived. She wasn't waiting to die, but she also was at peace with the notion that her death was probably near. And one of the ways in which she expressed that was she was very clear. And those of you know that in congestive heart failure, you often will have a number of hospitalizations later in your life because your electrolytes get out of balance, or there's a lot of things. And so you have to go in the hospital, kind of get fixed and rebalanced almost so that you can kind of continue. And so she was very, very clear about with the hospital folks that she did not want any extraordinary means to keep her alive. And she did not want to, if her heart stopped, she did not want a code to be run. She was at peace with the notion that when her heart would stop beating, it would stop beating, and she would move on to the next phase of her existence. And she was so clear that she would not, it wasn't enough that they would put it in the record. She was sophisticated enough to know that could be overlooked or ignored. So she insisted that they also put the DNR on her door of her room at the hospital when she'd go in. So there could be no mistaking what her wishes were or what they would do. So she went into the hospital, it turned out for the last time. Later that evening, and my two sisters were with her, two of my older sisters were with her, and they'd been with her for many hours, and she was seemingly doing okay. She seemed relatively stable, and they were hungry. They hadn't eaten anything. And so Mom, who always was taking care of everyone else in the room, so especially her kids, she really urged my sisters to go get some food down at the cafeteria. And so, are you sure, Mom? Oh yeah, I'm going to be fine, And And so off they went to the cafeteria. Well, while they were down at the cafeteria, her heart stopped. And you know, they did a code, a full on code. And she, fortunately, I think for her, she did not come back. I mean, her heart had stopped and she had moved on. But I'll tell you, you know, we sat down with that troop of doctors and we gave them the third degree. Like, what were you thinking? Gee, it was in the record. It was on her door. What the hell happened? And because I viewed it as like medical battery. And they basically, after a lot of hemming and hawing, first trying to deny that they had ever, you know, that they didn't see the signs, or they didn't know, you know, that she had a DNR and all this kind of stuff. They basically admitted that they didn't want her to die on their shift. And that, unfortunately, is all too true in healthcare. It isn't about affecting a healing, because the healing thing would have been to honor her wishes and allow her to die in peace. But they were all about cure. It was like, we got to get this heart going again. And it's like, we, you know, because a death is a failure and we don't want that to happen on our shift. So I tell that story because that, to me, is healing is not something soft. It's like servant leadership. I'll just, you know, kind of jump over and say that a lot of people think that's, oh, that's so soft and emotional. No, it isn't. It's the hardest type of leadership, the most demanding kind of leadership you can have, because you can't boss people around. You have to lead them. You have to serve them. You have to inspire them to go in the direction that you believe is the right direction for the organization. And you have to be willing to give them the power to say yes or no to that. And so you have to win them. And healing is kind of like that. Healing is about putting the patient in the power position and listening to what their wishes are and what their and their family's wishes are, and then doing your very best to bring your skill and your knowledge to meet at least at halfway what their desires are, and that you proceed together in that journey. And often I've seen a lot of patients and families who have been cured, who were not healed, especially cancer patients. I do, you know, especially where I really see it is with young, where the child had cancer and they went through the, you know, very difficult treatment, and the parents were living in the hospital with them and going through this enormous, difficult process. And guess what? The child got cured. That family was not healed. And that the hospitals tend to just drop them. You know, it's like they move on to the next one. And so there's been a lot of work here in Portland, actually, and somebody that I know well and who's really worked, they call it the Bridges program, because it's about helping bridge the family back to a healing after the cure is affected. And or if the cure isn't affected, helping that family. And so staying with the family after whatever the outcome of the treatment program is. And I just think that's such a powerful concept that needs to be, you know, spurred and fostered. We became the Cambia Foundation, became the founding funder, you know, for that program, because it was just it spoke to us so powerfully. That's what healthcare should be about. It's about.
So, folks, I apologize. We have 3 more questions, and we really only
go
have
ahead.
time for 1 more.
Jump
So,
in.
hopefully, Mark will answer the other 2 offline if he's willing. But as a last question, I think this is really a good choice. Much of what you were talking about is basic customer service. I have experienced lapses in customer service by both the health plan and the clinician's offices. Is there a simple solution to help make the patient or caregiver feel heard?
No, I mean, yes and no. Yes, the answer is start with being curious. I mean, I know what we work very hard at training our quote customer service professionals to be real, you know, and start by listening and be good at knowing that the person who's calling with often what appears to be a transactional kind of question, to really train them to listen to what's really going on in their life and to ask in a courteous way if there might be something, to probe if there might be something more. And it's amazing how often there is something that's much, especially during this pandemic, a transaction is often rooted and grounded in a deep loneliness and isolation that people are feeling, where they just need to talk to someone. And why the excuse might have been a transaction, what they're really wanting is some empathy coming their way, some sense of connection. And we're okay with that. I mean, it's like when I first took over the company, they actually timed people for how long they were on the phone, and they got dinged if they were on the phone too long with a customer. So guess what people were good at? If they got kind of behind, I kid you not, this is, thank God it was 22 years ago and not now, but people would literally, when the queue would happen and the person would come on, they'd hang up on them without ever even greeting them, because they'd get credit for a very fast phone call and that would boost their customer service scores. I mean, that's the craziness. I mean, I've had that happen to me, like when I call airlines or something. Have you ever had that situation where you're on hold for a long time and then all of a sudden you hear that you're coming off hold and then suddenly
Happens to me all the time.
Yeah. Well, it's, to me, that's that mentality of, it's people trying to follow rules as opposed to follow the patient, follow the customer. So to me, it's as simple as a leader, giving people the permission to engage people as human beings and not as a transaction. Now, why I say it's really hard is that to change that culture in the company, it didn't happen because I demanded it, because I did. I mean, it made it clear that was what we were going to do. But it took, frankly, years for it to really take root, for people first to believe that this wasn't just a strategy of the day that's going to change 5 days from now, to really believe that it was going to be safe to do that. And then to learn how to do it, the skill set of knowing how to listen and probe and really serve as opposed to tell. So I would just say, you can't wait till tomorrow to get on that. So you asked that question, and I think it's about human relationship and valuing that more than anything. And you can't wait. You can't say, I'll do that tomorrow. You have to start now, and you have to fight your own culture if it's not lined up that way. As a patient and as a customer, the only thing I could say is, if you run into some, that kind of bad customer service, don't be afraid to go up the chain if you have to as a customer and demand to speak to a manager or supervisor, and just take it as far as you can possibly take it. And if necessary, write the CEO. Some of the best indications I got as CEO was when customers took the time to write me, because I read the letters and I was appalled. And it was really interesting when I call the person that was the head of that department and say, I got this letter. Let me read a few passages to you. The power that brought, because I didn't have to yell at them or speak loudly to them. I just let the customer's words sink in on them, and they had to own it. They had to, and that's how I did it. I just spoke softly, but I also said, don't you think we can do better than that? And then they would say, well, yes. And if they tried to make excuses, well, then I could deal with that. But if they didn't, and they just said yes, then I would say, so how are you going to take care of this? And I would just ask them questions until they got to the notion of, well, I'm going to call this person right now. I'm not going to pass the buck down. I'm going to call this person right now, and I'm going to apologize to them, and I'm going to make it right. And I said, good. And then I would say, and what are you going to do to make sure that this is not inflicted on every one of our other customers? In other words, I always viewed something like that, to use an iceberg analogy, it wasn't just a piece of ice floating on the water. Always assume it's just the tip of an iceberg, and tried to teach that with the leaders to always get curious. Like if that happened in one time in your area, you got to assume that that was an extraordinary individual to have written me as the CEO, because it took time and it took courage on their part, and to always honor that and thank them for it. So
and that it wasn't an isolated event. The fact that someone wrote is a pretty good indication that it might be a problem.
yes, so that's
Mark,
what I would say.
Right. We're at the top of our hour. We have had a terrific conversation with you. We put up a poll for those of you who are still online to enter what you think about today's discussion. We will be continuing these Vantage Point webinars through this, or interviews through the year. We encourage you to join us and to enjoy the wisdom and the introspection that a conversation like this affords us. Mark, Gans, I want to thank you very much for your time today. It was a riveting and thought-provoking, and I find it inspiring. I think the notion of being a servant leader is one of the best guide stars that you can have in terms of how would you like to be treated and how do you treat others. And I thank you for sharing that with us today. I thank you for joining us. As soon as you find your next gig, I want to know what it is, and I want to be able to talk to you about it, okay? So with that, you're welcome, Mark. And with that, I want to thank, first again, Mark, I want to thank you, and I want to thank everybody who joined us today, and allow folks to get back to the business that they have at work, and possibly with some of the wisdom that was shared today. So thank you all. And Mark, thank you very much. We're adjourned.
My pleasure.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much, Mark.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.